Once loyal but scarred by war, the Death Guard were blessed by Nurgle and became the vile and blighted Marines they are known today. Hello and welcome to this painting video. In this video we'll be showing you how to paint a Legionnaire in the colours of the Death Guard. So grab your brushes and shake your paints and let's get started. Now the first thing that we need to do is undercoat our model, and as you can see here I've used Wraithbone spray for a nice light undercoat. So now we can start off with our base coats. We'll be starting off with Rakarth Flesh for the main body armour, and then Death Guard Green for the shoulder pads. So we're just going to dip into our Rakarth Flesh. I'm going to get a good amount off onto our palette. Then we can thin it down with a touch of water, just so it's not too goopy on our brush, and then we can start applying it to our model. So we're going to apply the Rakarth Flesh to all over the armour except for the shoulder pads. And don't worry, if you just need another couple of coats to get a nice coverage. Now that our Rakarth Flesh is now dry, we can move on to the shoulder pads. We're going to use Death Guard Green for this. So it's a slightly thinner colour, so you may need a couple of coats. Now that the armour is dry, we can move on to the rest of the base coats. We'll be starting off with the metallics, and we'll be using Leadbelcher for the silver details, and Runord Brass for the bronze details, then moving on to Corvus Black for the black details, and then finishing off with eye lenses in Corn Red. So let's get on with that Leadbelcher. So we're going to dip onto the pot, I'm going to get a sizable amount out, I'm going to thin it down slightly to get it nice and smooth onto our brush. We're going to make sure we don't get too much on there as well. And then we can start applying it to our silver details. Now we'll be applying it to the gun. We're going to make sure that we don't get it everywhere, and we're avoiding any of those fingers and anywhere else that we've already painted, but don't worry, if you do get it on those places, we can go over with those base coats. And we're going to use this on the bonding studs on the shoulder pad, the details on the backpack, and the chest plate centre. Now that our metallic base coats are dry, we can move on to the Corvus Black, and we're going to be using this on the gun casing and the joints of the undersuit. Just make sure that you avoid any of the metals and the fingers that you've already painted, but don't worry, you can always go over there with the other base coats. And with the Corvus Black now dry, we can move on to the Corn Red for the lenses. Just remember to be neat and use a small fine brush. And now that our base coats are all dry, we can move on to the shading. For this we'll be using Seraphim Sepia Thin Down with Lamia Medium for the armour, and Agrax Earthshade for the brass and silver details. So we're going to get 1 part Lamia Medium, we're going to pop it onto our palette, and then we're going to wash our brush and dry it off, and then we're going to add 1 part Seraphim Sepia to it. Just make sure that's all mixed up, and we don't have too much on our brush because we don't want it to pool, and then we can start applying it to the armour. So we're just going to make sure that it goes all over the cream areas and the green plates on the shoulder pad. Don't worry if it starts pooling, you can always take a dry brush and mop it up. Now that our Seraphim Sepia is now dry, we can move on to Agrax Earthshade, and we'll be moving that all over the silver and the brass details. And now with our shades dry, we can move on to the highlights. We'll be starting off with the cream armour. We'll be using Rakarth Flesh followed by Pallid Witch Flesh, and then the green armour we'll be using Nurgling Green followed by Krieg Khaki. So let's go on with that Rakarth Flesh. So we're just going to take it out of the pot as we did before. I'm going to get it on our palette, and we're going to thin it down a touch, but we're going to make sure that we don't have too much on our brush, and we're going to make sure our brush is at a lovely point before adding it to our model. And there we go. And now we can start applying it to the armour. So we just want to make sure that our line is neat, but this can be our chunky highlight, so it can be a little thicker than normal. And you may want to do another layer just in case, because it's quite subtle. Now that our Rakarth flesh is now dry, we can do the Pallid Witch flesh for our edge highlight. So I want to make sure this one's much thinner and a little bit smaller, but you can add more layers if you want to afterwards. Just make sure it's nice and thin and your brush is pointy. Now that the cream armour is finished, we can move on to the green shoulder pads. We're going to use Nurgling Green for our chunky highlight. So we're just going to go around the edges of the shoulder pad and make sure that we get these nice details finished up as well, avoiding the kind of groove in the shoulder pad. And now that's dry, we can finish off with the edge highlight of Krieg Khaki. So we just want to brush the edge of the brush along the shoulder pad just so it's nice and neat. So it's a nice easy way to get a thin edge highlight on everything that has a flat edge. You can always use the edge of the brush as well as the tip to get a nice clean finish on an edge of a shoulder pad or anywhere that is flat. And with the green done, we can move on to the rest of our highlights. We'll be starting off with Knaptek Alloy for our brass details, Stormhost Silver for our silver details, and Mechanicus Standard Grey for our black details. So let's get on with that Knaptek Alloy. So we're going to just dip into the pot. It's quite a nice thin paint, but we do want to make sure that our brush is very pointy for this. So we're just going to make sure that it's very fine. And now we can start applying it to the brass details. So we're just going to highlight very gently on the tips of the areas that we want to make sure that look burnished or slightly worn away. And remember to do the studs as well, but be very delicate. And with the brass done, we can move on to the Stormhost Silver for the silver details. So we just want to run this around the edges of the bolt gun just to give it a worn look, and on top of any of the piping as well, or any metalwork edges. We don't want to add too much, we just want to be very careful of where we apply it to the edges. And with the silver done, we can move on to the black, and we'll be using the Mechanicus Standard Grey to just do the highlighting. So we're just going around the edge of the gun casing, and you can also use this colour for the under suit as well. And with those colours done, we can move on to the lenses and some rust effect. For the lenses, we'll be using Mephiston Red and Troll Slayer Orange for the highlighting, and for the rust effect, we'll be using Rhinox Hide and Mournfang Brown, both thinned down with Lamia Medium. So let's get on with the lenses. So we're going to take out the Mephiston Red from our pot. We're going to thin it down slightly because it is a little bit thicker than we need, especially for such a small area. I'm going to get our brush very pointy, and then we can start applying it to the lenses. So these are very small areas, so do take your time and balance yourself. And you're only going to put a little bit towards the bottom part of the lens. Now with the red dry, we can add a dot of Troll Slayer Orange to the lens. Just be very careful and take your time. And with the lenses done, we can start with the rust effects. We'll be taking 1 part Rhinox Hide and thinning it down with 1 part Lamia Medium. We're going to run this in the recesses of the armour for a dirty, worn look. And now that our darker rusty grime is finished, we can move on to the lighter rust, and we'll be using 1 part Mournfang Brown to 1 part Lamia Medium for this. We're going to be applying the rust over areas like metallics and over the studs as well. And now that all the colours are done on the model, we can move on to the basing. For this, we'll be taking Sterling Mud, and we'll be using our trusty texture tool for this. So we're just going to take the wide end of the scoop, and we're going to get a good amount off. Then we can start applying it to the base. So you don't have to be too careful about this because we do want some going around the feet of the model as well, so it looks like he's been treading around in it. But you also can make little pools and little dips around in areas of the base for one of our cool things we're doing later. Now that the sternum mud is now dry, we can finish off the base. We'll be starting off with a dry brush of Baneblade Brown, and then finishing it off with Nurgle's Rot for some acrid, dirty pools of water. So let's get on with that dry brush. So we're going to dip into the top of the pot. I'm going to take a small amount so we don't have too much on, and then we're going to work in small circular motions, getting rid of the moisture from the paint. And now that is quite nice and neat as well on the brush, we can start applying it to our base. Now we're just going to be gentle on the top, so we just catch the tops of the pools. And with our dry brush now done, we can add the Nurgle's Rot into these little pooled areas we made earlier. You can have a couple of coats in this to build it up around the mud area. And there we are with the base now done. Paint the rim of the model in a colour that matches the rest of your army. For this we have used Abaddon Black. With the base completed and the rim painted, our Legionnaire is ready to infect planets and tear down armies in the name of Nurgle and the War Master. So just a couple of things to remember while painting. With recess shading, you can always add multiple layers of a colour rather than overloading your brush, and with Nurgle's Rot you can always add it to the recesses of the armour for extra Nurgliness. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy painting your own Death Guard Marines, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.